We're on to life in Surtsey. Again, you should always pause if you haven't and tell somebody what you remember. We talked about the lighthouse last week and going inside the crater. Interesting. What they were looking for and how they captured different insects and what they do, what were a couple of the insects that they found there. So if you haven't done that, go ahead and pause and do that and then come on back. Okay, so we are going to begin on page 54. Remember they found the gull carcass. There's a picture right there. And that was exciting because insects in gull carcasses, in any carcass. So let's begin. Erling and Matthias do eventually eat lunch, but soon after they are back in the gull colony. It's the center of insect life, and so the center of their collecting. They've already set pitfall traps here and a tent trap, and earlier this morning they'd collected flying insects with their nets. What could possibly be left for them to do? Hand picking, just as they did on the spit yesterday. There are several species of insects known to live in the gull colony that can only be collected individually. Weevils, for example, don't fly, so they won't turn up in a sweep net. And since they spend their entire lives crawling on a single plant, they're unlikely to end up in a pitfall trap either. In order to collect these critters, Erling has to pick them up one by one. He starts by finding a mound of scurvy grass and settling down next to it. Then he unpacks a couple of special collecting tools along with his glasses and peers closely at the plant. He finds signs of weevils right away. Weevil larvae chew tunnels in scurvy leaves, and these tunnels turn brown and are easy to see. It's not long, though, before he spots adult weevils, too. This particular species of weevil is too small and delicate to collect with tweezers, but too big for the paintbrush technique. Erling used to collect springtails earlier in the week. How, then, to collect them? Simple. He sticks a suction tool in his mouth and sucks them up one by one. Don't worry, there's a barrier inside the flexible straw, like tube of his suction tool, so there's no chance he'll swallow a weevil. He simply sucks each weevil up into the tube, then blows it gently out into his collection vial. Ooh, I was worried. Meanwhile, Matthias unfurls a flag of white fabric, lays it on the grass, and drags it around behind him. The flag is called a tick sheet, and it's great for collecting tiny invertebrates that live in the long grass and are otherwise difficult to capture. He drags the sheet for what feels like a very long time, collecting, for this effort, a single mite. It's much too small to identify on site, so he adds it to the growing collection of 2,015 insect samples to be examined back in the lab. Erling and Matthias spend almost every waking moment of their third day on the island collecting insects. They capture hundreds. The most exciting by far are several moths of the species Cochilus dubitana. This species has never been collected on Surtsey before, nor has the moth species Scrobbill palpa salmondensis, which Matthias finds in the early evening in the lava and close to the hut. Later, over a dinner of pasta and meat sauce, the entire expedition team toasts the two new insect species. Another day on Surtsey comes to a close. How often in your family do y'all toast finding or celebrate finding a new insect in your yard? Most of the time, your dad probably groans and thinks he's just going to have to eradicate it. So here's a picture of them crawling through, and Mr. Erling with his suction cup. And I hope yeah. And there's the weevil. See how it crisscrossed on the plant? Okay, so this begins a new chapter, so I want you to pause the video and tell somebody what you learned about how they collected insects. Okay, and so we're back on page 52, and this says Mr. Erling, surrounded by wooden marking stakes, collect a pitfall trap from the lava sand on Surtsey. So that's this picture here. And we're going to talk about their departure. Kind of sad, isn't it? It seems like it just started, but now they're leaving. The last full on-island workday feels special from the beginning. The sun has returned, accounting for some of the brightness. But there are other signs too. The door of the research hut is opened wide during breakfast, and through it drifts the happy, husky warbling of a snow bunting. Later, Borgpor retrieves a shovel from under the hut and starts to dig in the sand near the fridge, eventually unearthing, or rather unlava sanding, a large plastic bag. Dinner, he says mysteriously, carrying it into the hut. Back inside, Matthias takes his time packing up for one final day in the field. He and Erling have decided to separate for the morning, each retrieving half of the pitfall traps they set on the first day of the expedition. Matthias will collect traps on the south side of the island, and he sets out first. As he walks away from the hut alone, Erling smiles like a father watching his kid go off to kindergarten. You always see insects when you forget your net, he says, pointing to the one Matthias left propped on the porch. Erling will collect traps on the north side of the island. He begins in a lime grass habitat very close to the hut. His procedure is pretty much the reverse of the one he used to set the traps 4 days earlier. He photographs the plot from its edge, marches in, kneels next to the trap, disassembles the tented lid, and lifts out the plastic cup. Because he can't help himself, he peeks inside each cup briefly, hoping to see a new insect or two. Eventually, he drops a handwritten label, plot number, and date into each cup. Sorry, Abigail's getting water. Then he adds a splash of alcohol, snaps a lid onto the container, and drops it into his backpack. He'll examine each and every insect more closely back in his laboratory. As he works, Erling shares a few theories that might explain why a moth is fairly common in Iceland. Cochilus dubitana was found on Surtsey only this year. He and Matthias netted several specimens in the gold colony yesterday. Why have they never seen this common moth here before? The first two theories are quite simple. Although scientific expeditions have come to Surtsey every year since 1965, there have been many years when no insects were sampled. Between 1972 and 1984, for example, Erling visited the island only 3 times. If the Cochilus dubitana moth lived here during those years, it would have been easy to miss it. Second, it's possible that it simply took this species an extraordinary long time to make it to the island. The third theory is the one weighing most heavily on Erling's mind today. He shares it out loud during his last morning of field work. You never know what you are missing, he starts. He explains that he and Matthias monitor insects on Surtsey for just 5 days every July. So the remaining 360 days of the year, no one is monitoring insect life here. Who knows what flies or crawls along the island on those days? No one. But sometimes conditions on Surtsey change unexpectedly, just enough to allow resident but undetected insects to be noticed. This year, for example, was a strange one in Iceland. The entire country, including Surtsey, experienced a late spring. Unusually cold temperatures lingered well into the month of June, delaying the growth and development of both plants and insects, including such moths as Cochilus dubitana. Moths have a 4-part life cycle: egg, larva, or caterpillar, pupa, adult. This life cycle in C. dubitana is perfectly timed with the seasons. The insects spend the winter in the pupal stage. Early in spring, the adult moths emerge and begin to fly. In a typical Icelandic summer, this would happen in early June. The adult moths live for only a couple of weeks, just enough time to mate and produce a new generation of eggs. These eggs hatch caterpillars during the month of July, and the caterpillars spend the rest of the summer eating and growing on their host plants. Come fall, the fully grown caterpillars form pupae, and the cycle begins anew. As you know, Erling and Matthias always visit Surtsey for a single week in early July. It makes sense that in most years they'd never see C. dubitana moths, even if the moths were living on the island. In a typical year, the adults are in the flying stage of their life cycle only in June. According to Erling's new theory, however, this year's late spring may have delayed the entire C. dubitana life cycle. Adult moths that would normally have emerged earlier in the spring emerged instead at the end of June, and a few of those adult moths were still alive in early July when the 2015 expedition team arrived. The way to avoid missing insects in this way, at least in Erling's mind, is to visit Surtsey more frequently. It might be hard for him to stay for the entire summer as he did when he was in his 20s, but he could easily make 3 trips a season, one in June, one in July, and one in August. He's convinced that if he did, he would collect a lot of insects so far undocumented on Surtsey. In support of this theory, Erling tells a couple of stories. In 2011, he accompanied a documentary filmmaking crew to Surtsey in the month of June. As the crew collected the footage they needed for their film, Erling collected insects. It's just what entomologists do. He found specimens of 2 fly species that had never before been seen on Surtsey. 2 years later, he had the chance to go in September with a German television crew. That time, he found a new to Surtsey spider. You never know what you are missing, Erling repeats. I need to make 3 expeditions every summer. And that would be fun, wouldn't it? So I'm going to show you a picture here of the adult moth, the Cochilus dubitana he's been talking about. And of course the life cycle right there, but there's the moth. I'll get you a closer picture. Kind of pretty, isn't it, with those stripes on there? I'd love to see it with its wings unfurled. And then this is moss growing on Surtsey early in the morning. It's a pretty picture right there. And then next time we'll read about Surtsey's lava. So tell someone what you've learned about insect collecting and the possible changes that can happen in insect collecting to somebody. For your experiment, instead of sitting in the grass in the shade for 20 minutes to try to write down the kind of insects that you see, if you have a net, especially in a summer evening, I don't know why the warmer evenings, doesn't have to be summer of course, but warmer evenings, go with your net and walk through your yard and collect, just walk around collecting and see what you can find. It'll have to be a thinner net, not thick, but I know they sell them at Dollar Tree a lot of times. And then write down any of the insects that you find and be an insect collector, an entomologist, and then find out, if you can, the names of the insects, write down their scientific name, do a little drawing of them. It'd be kind of neat to see all the different kinds that you could find over like a week. So that is all for science, and we'll see you next week for the last part of our book.